So we're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you for joining me. So today I'm going to be talking about auditing with the DAG. And honestly, it is my favorite way to identify problem areas. In my experience, it's provided some really impactful insights for how our projects and teams can improve. I am just a DAG fan at this point. All right, so I want to start with the common issues. And these are just things that I have heard before starting an audit. So I might hear that the jobs take a long time to complete, the team isn't exactly sure if they're doing things correctly, or that the models are becoming hard to manage. And even though only one of these might be presented initially, they usually are. I find that whenever I start digging, the issues really go hand in hand. And that led me to ask the question, why is that? So I think it's because there's a mixture of two mindsets going on here in these projects. So for example, in a traditional workflow, we typically see that each main idea is built from raw data, and that results in the same transformations existing in multiple places. When we start using DBT, we start considering how the transformations exist across all of our models, and we do our best to form those into components. And once those are components, we inject those into our main ideas using refs. So whenever we were mixing our traditional mindset with the functionality of DBT, essentially we're just seeing a reflection of our traditional modeling techniques in the DAG. And that ends up looking like this. So what we want to do is go from a DAG that looks like this, which is starting to become hard to understand, unmanageable. It's almost certainly not as performant as it could be, to something like this. And I know this isn't a real DAG, but this is kind of the goal that we want to get to. So this is still as complex, but it has a well-defined structure and it has data governance. So how do we get there? I really think the answer is putting our DAG first while developing. The DAG isn't just a tool that knows the order that you want to execute models in. It's a reflection of your ideas and your thought processes behind your end goals. But in order to really analyze our DAG as we're developing at all, what we need to do is define some foundations. So we know what we're looking for whenever we're looking at our DAG. So the first thing we need to define is what are the types of models we can use, first of all. Second of all, we need to know what those model types are responsible for. So I'll refer to those as layering concepts. And then finally, we need to ensure that we're thinking about building our components properly. And what that means is that the models we build have high reusability or reflect a major transformation in the data's journey to the end model. All right, so let's talk about model types first. So I'm going to be talking a lot about Fishtown conventions here, but having any conventions or your own definitions are just as great. The point really is that you have those conventions, so you have standards to go by, because you really can't audit your DBT project if you don't have that. All right, so whenever we build projects, we set up a staging folder. And in this folder, we have base and staging models. So we prefix these to our model names. They're typically a one-to-one reflection of the source. And we do really light transformations here. So we do things like casting, renaming, filtering out deleted records. And we don't do any joining really as a result of that, but there are some specific use cases. And the purpose of these models is just to clean up and standardize the raw data coming from the warehouse, so we have consistency when we use them in downstream models. It also has the benefit of relocating any transformations which deviate from the standard with the flow that is happening in. So that way we have better tabs on when, where, and why things happen. All right, so then we have a marts folder. In this folder, we prefix our models with intermediate, dimension, or fact. This is where we start applying business logic. And as a result, these typically have heavier transformations than in staging. And the common SQL that you'll see here are joins, unions, case wins, window functions. Really nothing's off limits here. And then the purpose of these models is to form the data using our business perspectives in order to build our core entities. All right, so now that we've got our model types down, let's talk about how we'll use each of those. I'm going to use an example here. So we're going to make a salad, and I'm going to take you through each layer as I build up to that main idea of a salad. All right, so we're going to start with our raw ingredients, and this is the things that just exist in my warehouse. We've referred to these as sources. And the first models I'm going to build are my staging models. And you can see I'm really just prepping each individual ingredient here. If you think of these things as being available on an assembly line, you can see it'll be really easy to make my salad, except for the Italian dressing. So you notice it's not hooked up. If I stage the sources that create that, so most notably the vinegar and Italian seasoning, but also water and oil are part of that, it's not going to be really easy for my developers to take those and make Italian dressing. They've got to mix it up every time. So this is one of those specific use cases for doing a join-in staging. Vinegar and Italian seasoning at this level are really useless to my business until they form Italian dressing. So I'm making a modeling decision here based on what I know about my business. So in order to do this join, I'm going to implement a base layer. So this layer takes over what staging usually does. And the reason we provide this is because we always want to have a model which standardizes our data, whether it be a base or staging model. So our downstream models can benefit from that transformation, and we can start developing consistency in how our data is commonly used. So now I'm going to join up everything needed to create my Italian dressing. And just to contrast what I said about this modeling decision, let's just throw something out there. Let's consider boiling eggs and staging. So do you think I'm doing things correctly if I do it here? The answer is yes, and it's no. There's really no wrong answer. It just, again, depends on the answer or what you know about your business. So the answer is yes if I only make salads. The answer is no if my business serves breakfast. Because if I boiled my eggs when prepping my ingredients, my chefs wouldn't be able to create scrambled eggs. So we're just going to leave the eggs as is. All right. Now I'm going to build my intermediate layer where I'm going to conduct some major transformations with my data. And like base, this layer is completely optional, but it's especially useful for creating reusable components or breaking up large transformations into more understandable pieces. Finally, I'm going to join in all of those steps in order to make my salad. So now this is ready for our waiters to use in custom orders. The difference between food and data is that my waiter can get a custom order for a salad without eggs and accomplish that with this model. This is supplying enough information to answer various questions, so it has high reusability. So we strive to get that reusability with all of our models. If I add in some other menu items, you can see how the other menu items might reuse some of my intermediate steps. And at this point, it's really good to define where your transformations stop and where your analysis begins. So both jobs might involve writing SQL, but our BI analyst custom orders start to deconstruct and mix our core business entities in ways that kind of conflict with how we've built things. So and they do this because they're trying to see the data from different perspectives of our business, which is okay, but they are custom. So we want to keep our transformations clean and free of those custom perspectives, or just define a line where that stops and where that begins. Okay, so now that we've defined our model layers, and how we should be building components, let's put that into practice. Okay, so if you look at your DAG and it looks like this and you're thinking about auditing it, it's just going to drive you crazy if you don't pick one place to focus. So that's what we're going to do. We're just going to pick one flow. I picked out this DC packing slip flow, and I apologize if this is very small. Let me try and stop my camera here. Hopefully that's a little better. Okay, so what we need to do with this flow is we need to organize it first. So that's what I did. And I tried my best to organize these by the layer concepts that I mentioned before. And before we continue, I'm also going to be making some assumptions, which I usually would verify by looking at code. What I'm doing is I'm using my DAG as a tool to flag me in the right direction. But for the purposes of this demo, I'm just going to skip most of the code verification, but you should always do that. You should always go into your code and verify your findings. All right, so let's pull this DAG out into a whiteboard so we can start sketching up our findings. All right, so there's some sources here that lead directly to a join. And what we want to do is we want to put some of those standardization models in between these flows. So in between the sources and these models where those sources are joined in. There's two types of models that we can add here. So we can add base models, which flow directly into the staging models at the end of these flows. or we could use staging models, but that means our current staging models are going to have to change into intermediates. So let's start with colorway items. And since this model joins in a lot of other database concepts, we're just going to assume that this is actually an intermediate. So we're just going to change that. Let's look at colorway item SKUs. So this one joins in the same models that we joined in with the colorway items, but it also joins in colorway items. And that tells me the results of the colorway items model isn't highly reusable. We had to reconduct a join to get more information out of it. So we're going to pretend that we've changed colorway items to account for the extra data we need and remove those joins. And then next, we are going to remove this join. And that's because the colorway items and colorway item SKUs models are both joined into DC packing slip. So we can do any necessary transformations that we need out of that join there. And that leaves us connected to the sizes in the source colorway item SKUs. And at this point, colorway item SKUs seems pretty straightforward to me as an intermediate. And I'm just saying that because sizes was given its own staging model. So why wouldn't the colorway item SKUs? So we're going to change that. All right, so if we take a moment now to look at DC packing slips dependencies, we can see the same rejoin behavior as we've seen in the previous models. So it's joining in joins that we've already done in other models, but it's also joining in those models. So again, this is about having models that aren't highly reusable. So we're going to remove those. And now let's have a look at master purchase order items here. It's a little harder to determine what type of model we should put between these flows. So let's look at the code to see if we can figure out what type of model should be here. So this model is numbering the rows by when the master purchase order was updated at in descending order per colorway item ID. We're only getting the most recent master purchase order in the results. And also we're only getting the IDs here. So what that means is we're going to have to rejoin in anything to get any additional information that we could have provided with this result set. And since this is aggregating and expressing our idea of colorway items most recent master purchase order, this is an intermediate model. So we're going to change that. But we're going to give it a very specific name. And I know this looks very long. This is colorway item master purchase orders. Sorry, latest colorway item master purchase orders. It's super long, but what I'm doing is I'm opting for clarity here, so that way it's easy to look at the DAG and understand what the model contains. And like the other intermediates, this model actually should be refactored to provide more information, so we can eliminate the possibility that we're going to need to rejoin anything here. If we want the latest master purchase orders, we can still provide that row number, and we can, instead of filtering in the model, we can filter in the model that uses it through a CTE. All right, so let's stop here and rearrange our models. So there's still something funny going on here, and that's because the colorway item master purchase orders doesn't really need to be connected at this point. This can be joined up in the DC packing slip model. So we're going to remove this connection, and we're just going to connect it here to DC packing slip. All right, let's rearrange again. All right, so it's getting there, and we still haven't touched on adding those standardization models. So since we've determined, here's the flows, since we've determined that these models are intermediates, then we know that we're going to add staging models. So there we go. And then there's one more thing I want to touch on, and that's this model here called colorway color parents. So the name stands out to me because it sounds like we might be extracting some information from the data we're getting from the warehouse. When looking at the code, I can see that there's a JSON array within the colorway source, and we're extracting the items of the array into their own model. And that makes sense because they're parents, so it's going to fan it out. So it does belong in its own model. Since color parents isn't a concept that we've made though, and it's something that our raw data supplied to us, it's not actually a marts model. It belongs as a staging model. So we'll need to implement a base to staging structure with this model, colorways. So the first thing we're going to do is rename this colorways model to base ERP colorways. And then the colorway color parents is going to be renamed to stage ERP colorway color parents. So let's rearrange our DAG one last time. There we go. And you can see that the colorway items model now injects the base ERP colorways model. And this is actually the most performant way you can model this. This is how a lot of us would choose to do this, and it's very dry. But there's another consideration to make here, and that's on enforcing developer habits. So if you have many base models and some of those base models shouldn't be developed on, it's possible that one of your developers may inadvertently build on the wrong model. So we can choose to add a staging model for colorways, but at this point, it's just going to be a select all. And it's purely a decision made as a trade-off between performance in exchange for layer enforcement. And it tells all of our developers that the staging layer is the one to always build from. All right, so let's talk about what we found in our exercise. So some standardization models were missing and layer purposes seem to be a little bit confused. So that would prompt me to ask if we have defined clear definitions on model types and how we use them. If we do, then I would look into my peer review processes to make sure nothing's missed. The biggest thing that we found was that the models were being built in a way that doesn't lend itself to high reusability. And that's a big issue because that's what causes the need to rejoin data over and over. It's a habit that reduces the quality of performance that we could have had. And if that habit is left unchecked, it can result in a project that's going to become hard to manage. So although we only audited a fraction of our DAG, it really gave us an amazing insight into how we can improve. And I'm almost certain that most of this is caused by low reusability and rejoins. Honestly, this is going to take a long time to fix. It's going to need to be worked on over time. And that's because higher priority tasks are going to take precedence over doing this refactor until these items get to a point where it becomes a bottleneck in development. But I'm really confident that if we put our DAGs first, we can reduce or eliminate that scenario and catch things like missing one-to-one models, repeated joins, and our DAG can even help us understand how well we're providing clarity for when, where, and why our transformations are happening. So our DAGs aren't just the order of model execution in our projects. They're the reflection of our mindsets and internal processes. And if we put our DAGs first, we'll start seeing more DAGs like this. Thank you.